And I believe you would know better than I. That house has since been moved again, is that right? Yeah, so that's really terrific.
Crow Island, where is it?
Next to Crow Island School? So what sort of things did I learn as I researched my home region, the North Shore? Well, one of the things I learned was that geography determined all kinds of things. You know, Skokie Valley Road, Skokie Valley this, Skokie Valley that. Guess what? The Skokie Valley really is a valley. It was basically a swamp that separated the shoreline suburbs from the inland communities, the commuter suburbs from the farm towns, the haves from the have-nots in earlier times. The valley was drained and today, of course, contains the Botanic Gardens, Skokie Lagoons, which is another one of those forks of the North Branch of the Chicago River, the Edens Expressway, and was also the route for the Skokie Valley branch of the North Shore Line. The North Shore Line was an interurban. Interurbans were this very short-lived form of transportation. They were like electric cars and streetcars. They ran as streetcars in the city, and then they'd run through the countryside and take you to another city. And they were pretty much put out of business once better roads were created between municipalities. The North Shore Line was developed by Samuel Insull, who was the great utilities baron. He was born in England, came to the U.S. to be the secretary to Thomas Edison, who was his hero, became president of ComEd. And he really didn't care much about transit, but he knew that rail lines would spur development. Where you ran a rail line, you'd get towns, and towns would need electricity and become customers of Commonwealth Edison. And I'm a little turned around. Where's the high tension wires in the bike path? Right next to this building. Right on that side of the, right on this side. Right along this building are some high tension wires and a bike path, right? That bike path is the abandoned right-of-way of the North Shore Line, and those utility wires are old Samuel Insull's utility wires running along there. And if you know Bishop Heating, I think it's still called Bishop Heating, that little Mediterranean-style building that's right at Old Deerfield Road and the Expressway, that's the old Briargate train station. And I actually remember picking up my dad at that station. It went out of business in the early 1960s. Before there were rail lines and good roads, trails through the soggy lowlands were built along ridges, and the ridges were remnants of ancient shorelines of Lake Michigan, one of the oldest ones, of course. Anytime you see Ridge Road, you're on a ridge. There was a high ground across the soggy prairie. The oldest one, or one of the oldest ones, of course, was Green Bay Road, which was the Green Bay Trail. Native Americans used it for centuries. The 500-mile round trip from Chicago to Green Bay took a month on foot in winter, and travelers would stop at inns along the way. One of those inns was Lapeer House, which was in Glencoe, founded by Anson Taylor, who was one of the first settlers in Glencoe. And it was called Lapeer House because he had actually run a pier out into the lake. Because in the days before you had good overland transportation, most of the lumber and building materials and supplies came into all of our communities here on schooners out of Chicago and out of Waukegan, which was called Little Fort, and other places. And then would be transported on these sort of primitive plank roads out into the hinterlands here. The beach, by the way, was the preferred way to travel in summer. It was smoother and you couldn't get lost as you could on the Green Bay Trail. Mail was carried along the beach until 1832, when an act of Congress improved the Green Bay Trail and named it an official post road for mail couriers on horseback. So before the Green Bay Trail was improved, it was perpetually muddy. According to one account, stagecoach passengers who paid cheaper fares were required to get out and help push the vehicle when it became stuck. And I liken this to flying Southwest Airlines. And the captain gets on and says, "It's a little cold out, you all have to get out and de-ice the wings." The valley, Skokie Valley, also determined a lot about alcohol and vice. When I was a kid, when Tom and I were growing up, we always, we were in Deerfield Highland Park, we always knew about Highwood. Highwood was supposedly the only place on the North Shore where you could get a drink. And of course it was built adjacent to Fort Sheridan. Turns out you could get a drink in a lot of other places on the North Shore, in North Chicago, which was of course adjacent to the Navy base, in that little triangle, that funny little triangle of land in your township, no man's land. And I will take a side note here because I've done a little more research on no man's land. Why was no man's land this odd little triangle of land, sort of not in Kenilworth, not in Wilmette? I guess New Trier Township had jurisdiction over no man's land, or the county did. It's likely that it was, when George Washington sent the surveyors out across the continent to survey the continent, as Jerome was telling you, they just put these straight lines across the continent, over mountains and through valleys, and most of that particular section is just out in the lake, right? So the only part of it that touches land is that little triangle along the lake shore. It wasn't claimed by any municipality, and it became no man's land, therefore not subject to a lot of local laws and regulations. You could build these incredibly tall, high-rise apartment buildings. You had casinos. It was the most fun place you could be on the North Shore.
And then
Winnetka annexed it. Wilmette, sorry. Another place where you could get a drink was Grosse Pointe, which was a German farming community that is now part of Western Wilmette. There were 15 taverns along Ridge Road. Prohibition killed that town, and it was annexed to Wilmette. And the town hall, which is a beautiful building, is now, or at least it's still the Wilmette Historical Museum? Yeah, great. Now those inland farm communities, the ones on the other side of the valley, that's where everybody could go to party. So towns like Schermerville had such bad reputations that they actually had a contest to change their name, and it became Northbrook. Yes. You know who nominated the name for Northbrook? Edward Landwehr. So Landwehr Road. Right? Yeah. And then of course you had Niles Center, which is now Skokie. Evanston, settled by the Methodists there for Northwestern, had their famous 4-mile limit. They stuck a pin in Evanston and drew a circle around 4 miles. Couldn't have alcohol within those 4 miles. Of course, that wasn't, abided by. You could get a drink, and I think Grosse Pointe is within the 4-mile limit, probably no man's land. And certainly they would send these temperance, fighters out there to Niles Center to try to shut down the bars. But one Niles Center resident knew the truth about the situation. He said, our relationship with Evanston is reciprocal. We buy their water, they buy our booze. People used to literally go in canoes across the Skokie Valley when it was in wet season to, visit the bars on the other side. One of the most fun things that I've been doing in the last few years on Channel 11 is this segment that we do on Thursday nights on our program Chicago Tonight that's called Ask Jeffrey, where people write in with their questions. And one of my things that I really enjoy is dispelling urban, or in some cases suburban, myths. One of my favorites is this suburban myth that Half-Day Road is so named because it was a half-day's journey from Chicago. How many people heard that when they were a kid? Right? We all heard that when they were a kid. Half-Day Roads because it was a half-day's journey, I don't know, on horseback or on foot to Chicago. Not true. First of all, it's not a half-day's journey to Chicago. And the reality is it was named for an Indian chief. His name was Indian Chief Aptakisik, and there's an Aptakisik Road. His name translates to something like sun at the meridian or half day, and he was apparently given that name because he could perform a task in half a day that a normal person would take a whole day to perform. My wife calls me Chief 2-Day. So there's a couple. I've got like a couple good trivia questions about the North Shore here. And then I'll conclude with something about Northfield, where we are right now. But I thought we'd make this into a little quiz. Now, don't shout out answers. Just think about whether you know the answer or not, or you can discuss it amongst yourselves. But then I'll tell you the answers. So, first one is, who is considered the father of the North Shore? Walter Gurnee, Antoine Wilmette, or William G. Edens? So think about that for a minute. Okay, it's not Edens. William G. Edens was a banker, and he was an early champion of paved roads. And of course, the Edens Highway is named for him. But the North Shore was well established by the time he headed the Illinois Highway Improvement Association in 1918. This is the group that convinced the state to spend $60 million to improve highways throughout Illinois. And by the way, Edens never owned or drove a car, according to the book Streetwise Chicago. It was not Antoine Wilmette, for whom the suburb of Wilmette is named. His name, by the way, was spelled O-U-I-L-E-M-E-T-T-E. He and his wife, Archange, who was a Native American, possibly made the worst real estate decision in the history of the North Shore. He was a French-Canadian fur trader. She was Potawatomi on her mother's side. In 1929, the U.S. government gave Archange more than 1,000 acres of lakefront property in what is now Wilmette and Evanston, in exchange for her family's help in negotiating one of those treaties that ultimately banished the Native Americans. But in 1833, that final treaty was signed, and all the Native Americans moved west of the Mississippi. Antoine and Archange could have stayed in Wilmette, but they sold their land for a few $1,000s and moved to Iowa. So the father of the North Shore is actually Walter Gurnee. Gurnee was an early Chicago mayor, saddle maker, and land speculator. He built the railroad that is today the Union Pacific North Line. We remember it as the Chicago and Northwestern. Originally it's Chicago and Milwaukee. From the beginning, Gurnee envisioned this string of railroad suburbs that would offer residents convenient transportation between the North Shore and downtown. And in a shrewd move, he located the stations adjacent to land he owned along the tracks. Gurnee's property became Lake Bluff, Highland Park, Glencoe, and Winnetka. Gurnee had planned to live out his days in a castle-like home in Glencoe on a huge tract of land he bought from his father-in-law, Matthew Coe. Coe's Glen became Glencoe. But property values fizzled, and Gurnee sold his land to another developer in the 1860s and moved back to New York State, where he was from. And by the way, Gurnee's former home is still standing there in Glencoe, and of course it's right across from the train station. And it's sort of an odd irony that the community named for Gurnee is a good 5 miles away from the North Shore. So, one other quick question, and then I'll give you my final thing on Northfield. So, Sheridan Road is named for Philip Henry Sheridan. Who was he? Was he a frontiersman and Pony Express rider whose grave is in Deerfield? Was he a Civil War general? Or was he an early settler of mixed blood whose Native American name was Sauganash? Okay, so he was not the frontiersman. That was John Kinsey Clark, who sometimes delivered goods on horseback into Deerfield and eventually moved there and is buried in the local cemetery. Sauganash actually is a very interesting character in Chicago history. This was a man otherwise known as Billy Caldwell. He was a Native American chief. He was the son of a European father and a Native American mother. And he was another one of these Native Americans who helped to negotiate the treaties that ultimately banished his people west of the Mississippi. And as with Archange, in recognition for his efforts, the federal government gave him a huge tract of land along the north branch of the Chicago River. It's along the Edens today, and that property is by Caldwell Avenue, and that's where you find Caldwell Woods Forest Preserve and Caldwell Golf Course and the Chicago neighborhood of Sauganash. Now, why was that put there? Well, it's because there was something called the Indian Boundary Line. And this was a line that ran parallel north and south to this canal that was created to connect the Lake Michigan, the Great Lakes to the Mississippi. And this is what brought settlement into this whole region. And the white settlers didn't want Native Americans anywhere near that canal. So they created this Indian Boundary Line. And if you follow that Indian Boundary Line, which is today Forest Preserve Drive and that little diagonal Rogers Avenue up in Rogers Park, if you put a ruler down on a map, where you hit the Chicago River North Branch, that's right where Billy Caldwell's property was. So he had to be outside the Indian Boundary Line, just like Archange had to be up here in Wilmette, outside the Indian Boundary Line. Or if you go up the Des Plaines River over by O'Hare, you'll find Robinson Woods. Robinson Woods is right north of the Indian Boundary Line, and it's named for Alexander Robinson, who was Native American name was Chichipinque, and he was another one of those Native Americans who helped negotiate the treaty that banished the rest of his people west of the Mississippi. So you have these very interesting archaeological remains of this history. So Sheridan was a Civil War general. He was living in Chicago when the Great Fire broke out in 1871. Fearing civil unrest, the mayor declared martial law and put Sheridan in charge. Sheridan also coordinated relief efforts after the fire, and of course Fort Sheridan is named for him. He was a Civil War general and West Point grad, and he's remembered for his ruthless campaign against Native Americans after the war. It's another interesting urban myth about Sheridan Road. You may have heard that Sheridan Road was originally designated as a military highway to take soldiers from Fort Sheridan down to the armories in Chicago to put down labor rebellions. The truth is that these armories were built in Chicago and in other cities around the time of the Haymarket riots for that purpose, for soldiers to come into our cities and put down labor revolts. One of those armories is now where the Museum of Contemporary Art is in Chicago. Another one is Oprah Winfrey's studio. But the people who developed Sheridan Road actually were imagining it as kind of another Lakeshore Drive. They wanted it to run up the lakeshore. And they actually went to the Secretary of the Army and made this case that you needed a military highway to go from Fort Sheridan down to the city. The Secretary of the Army didn't buy it. And that's why Sheridan Road sort of instead makes this circuitous route through the lagoons. And by the way, when you think about Billy Caldwell and Archange Wilmette, it is worth a reminder that the Native Americans really got a raw deal. According to the treaties, the U.S. government paid them 14.5 cents an acre. They then turned around and sold it to settlers for $1.25 an acre. And even at that amazing bargain basement price, by today's standard, the government was making an 800% profit on the land that they had, that the Indians had ceded to them. So finally, we're in Northfield, and I'll conclude with a little bit of about this community. We had wanted to include Northfield in our North Shore show, and we tried in vain to get permission to shoot. Apparently, according to my researcher, Susan Godfrey, who knows Susie Godfrey out there? Some of you do. My researcher, Susie Godfrey, you have to tell me if I'm remembering this correctly. There's apparently an old North Shore Line sign, like from a train station, somewhere in Northfield, maybe in the village hall or something. Yeah, they wouldn't let us in there to shoot it. So unfortunately, Northfield ended up on the cutting room floor. But here's what I wrote about Northfield. Maybe they read the script and that's why they didn't want us in the show. Here's what I wrote. Most people would hate having a swamp for a backyard, but the people in what is now Northfield loved it. They foraged for hay and grew horseradish. These were crops that wouldn't spoil on the long wagon trip into Chicago. Samuel Insull, as I told you, transformed Northfield. He developed the land along the Skokie Valley Electric Line. Insull wanted the name of the town to be Waubun, after the famous Potawatomi chief, but the locals just called their area Skokie Swamp. Not real good for real estate. So Insull held a contest to name the town, and mysteriously, Waubun won. 2 years later, on an inspection tour, Insull noticed that someone had changed the word "wa" at the train station to "hot," spelling "hot bun." That's when he ordered his real estate man to come up with a new name, and he came up with Northfield. And I believe my source for this was a woman named Arlen Lieber Presser, who's a local author and has written a number of those Arcadia history books. Are you here by any chance tonight? The Encyclopedia of Chicago actually tells a slightly different story, but I like Arlene's story much better. So thank you very much. I hope I lived up to all the billing. It's a little daunting, but I really appreciate Should we open the floor for, okay, do I need the moderator to open the floor for questions? Oh, I gotta hold up your green. Now, you can only ask me a question if you have a green card. No, that's not true. I think we have a couple of minutes for questions before we can get back to the real business of democracy. Yes?
How did the Potawatomi Indians regain the land that they now have the casino on?
how did the Potawatomi regain the land that they have the casino on? I am not, I play a historian on TV, but I'm not an expert in this. I believe that because they somehow legally are, you may know better than I, are considered a nation, they are not bound by the same laws that prevent gambling. I don't know if the casinos have to be on like Indian reservation land, or if just by virtue of being Potawatomi or any other Native American, you're allowed to open a gambling casino, but I believe that's the reason why. Yes?
Years ago, I was driving through Scotland, and I came across Glencoe, a small rural village, and I wondered if there was any relationship, and I wondered, therefore, if the last name Coe is also Scottish.
I don't know about whether the last name Coe is Scottish. It sounds like it might be. But there are a number of different stories about where Glencoe got its name. I told you one of them, which is that Matthew Coe. There is another story that, I don't know if it was Coe or some other settler, named Glencoe for his home back in Scotland or one of the British, one of the countries in Great Britain. But that is another one of those stories. Yes?
Jeff, was Fort Sheridan an Indian outpost back in, when was it developed? Do you know anything about Fort Sheridan?
Was Fort Sheridan an Indian outpost?
No.
I don't know. I don't think it was. And I think in the show, I do talk about when and why it was established, but honestly, I don't remember. So the video is right there in that machine, and maybe we can check afterwards. But I have to confess, I don't remember. I don't remember exactly when it was established or why. Yes.
I believe it was established by the people of Lake Forest who didn't want the commoners from Chicago coming out.
True?
To Lake Forest. Yeah, that's what I heard.
He said he believes it was established by the people of Lake Forest who didn't want the commoners from Chicago coming up. That one I don't believe. But, yes.
For our protection.
Didn't Pullman, the man who ran the Pullman trains down in the south side of Chicago,
Pullman.
I think he had something to do with establishing Fort Sheridan, because he wanted to be sure he had an army somewhat, not really near him, you know, too close, but for his purposes.
I just
against
honestly,
labor
I
unions or
don't
labor
remember.
problems.
I do think Fort Sheridan was established at this time when, you know, well, I won't go into it, but the story of the Haymarket, the
Right.
whole Haymarket
That's
affair in
exactly
Chicago.
why it was. That's why they established Fort Sheridan.
Right, they
There was
wanted,
also a hotel there, right next to it, called Hotel Moraine.
oh sure, the
Oh,
Marine
yeah.
Hotel, right?
Yes,
Oh,
but
we
that
know
was
that.
right. That's no longer there.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I do believe that Fort Sheridan grew out of this whole fear. You know, these
Yeah.
big, powerful captains of industry looked at the Haymarket affair and they thought, whoa, you know, this could get out of hand. And they wanted the army close by. Yes?
Are you familiar with the story of Antoine Wilmette providing shelter for John Kinsey during the Black Hawk Uprising?
Yeah, it was, right. That was, I actually may have misspoke just now in my speech. I'm not sure they were given the land because of help in negotiating the treaty. It may be that it was because Antoine and Archange sheltered John Kinsey and some of the other settlers during the Fort Dearborn, what, you know, in the pre-PC age was called the Fort Dearborn Massacre. It's actually now called the Battle of Fort Dearborn. And it's very interesting how, you know, the sort of the winners get to tell the history. Fort Dearborn was at the mouth of the Chicago River in the War of 1812. The Native Americans sided with the French. Captain William Wells, for whom Wells Street is named, came to Chicago from Indiana to lead the residents of Fort Dearborn and the local settlers out of there, to abandon the fort. And as they were moving south along the lakefront, down about where George Pullman's house was, actually, around it's across Lakeshore Drive from the parking lot to Soldier Field now. They saw some Native Americans poking their heads up from behind the dunes, and we don't know if they were just attacked or if they preemptively attacked the Native Americans, but it was a very big battle. Quite a few of the settlers were killed, and a few of the Native Americans were also killed. Yes, sir.
In your research, at least in Wilmette and perhaps Evans Johnston and Winnett as well, did you come across the fact that there was an interurban branch line that ran east of the Skokie Valley line that I guess paralleled it and was east of Greenfield Road?
Yeah, that was the first one, the first North Shore line, which I actually think also might have been called the Chicago and Milwaukee. Ran around the loop downtown on the L, and then ran up the loop structure to Linden, and then at Linden it became a streetcar, and it ran west on what street? Greenleaf, over to what is now the Green Bay Bicycle Trail, right there adjacent to.
It was parallel.
Right, ran right next to what are the Northwestern tracks, just east of the Northwestern tracks, and you could go all the way up to Milwaukee.
Yeah.
Insull bought that, and he didn't think it was a fast enough way to get to Milwaukee. It was, you had to go through city streets, and it was slow. He had he had opera playing in the cars. You could listen to opera. But he wanted a high-speed line. So he built the Skokie Valley branch. So at Howard Street, what is now the Skokie Swift, that was Samuel Insull. It split away from the main branch that went up the North Shore, and he created these high-speed trains called the Electroliners that were these silver trains that were rounded at both ends. And, this will be the last question, and that was our last question. And the thing I always like to point out, and I'll close with this, is we had high-speed rail in this country. We had it. We had a great system of high-speed rail in this country.
And I wish it were back.
And it's very interesting that we let it go. And now we're trying to spend billions of dollars to bring it back because it was a good idea. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. As we continue let our moderator and clerk and elected officials get back up here. Take a breath. And we're going to do our awards now at this point. So don't go away. There's more good stuff here.